it's rather overwhelming. I'm not going to pretend to be able to define it this afternoon, just to look at certain aspects of it, and I'd obviously be delighted to hear your individual takes on it later. And it's a fascinating subject. It's also, as Gert has pointed out, a very, very timely one. But if I interpret the theme literally, I could sum it up very briefly, because the next promise of design, I think, is exactly the same as the old promise, the 20th century promise. It's to build a better world. Because if designers don't want to do that, I don't know why they'd bother being in design. And I've yet to meet a designer who doesn't have that intention, or who at least didn't dream of doing that when they started out in their career, although whether or not they succeed is, of course, very different. But if the promise of design is the same in this century as the last, the ways in which designers can hope to fulfill it have changed dramatically. And that's because the modernist dream is over, and the certainties that define design for much of the 20th century have collapsed. And we're all familiar with the reasons: environmental crisis, economic recession, the backlash against globalization, technophobia, the glum truth that most designers devote much of their time to, in the words of the eco-pioneer Victor Papanek, persuading people to buy things that they don't need with money they don't have to impress neighbours who don't care. And we do, of course, have a consumer culture that was summed up, I felt, rather memorably by a character in the TV series Gossip Girl. And for any of you who, like me, have trashy taste in television and watch it, it was Serena talking about her mother, who described her mother's spending habits as being in the syndrome, if it ain't broke, break it. So in this context, the modernist dream seems at best naive and at worst meaningless, but of course it wasn't. And a couple of days ago, a friend reminded me of how powerful and romantic it must have seemed. He was talking about his grandfather, who rather glamorously studied architecture at the Bauhaus in the late 1920s, when the school was run by the communist architect Hannes Meyer. And the grandfather, like his fellow students, was taught the modernist doctrines of utilitarianism, rationalism, that form must always follow function, that technology is a force for good, and that the new is better than the old. And the grandfather apparently stuck to these principles very happily throughout his career. And that's understandable, because however quaint they seem now, and however fashionable it is to dismiss modernism, it achieved a great deal, at least for part of the global population. The problem is that, of course, we now realize that its success was only partial, and that it also, unwittingly, caused a great deal of damage. So this, in a nutshell, is why design had to change, and why it's changing so dramatically now. The critical question is what it will change to. And we've gone through a period which I think, in retrospect, in say 20 or 30 years' time, design historians will see as being A, very confused, and B, very cynical. When design tended to be dismissed as eye candy, many designers seemed happy to treat us as such, and consumers seemed willing to pay small fortunes for those horrible, wobbly Philippe Starck lemon squeezers that stung their eyes by spraying them with lemon juice. But after that, we're now beginning to get a sense of what we can expect and hope design will deliver in the future. So I would like to begin by looking at two images that I think sum up the transition between the old model of design and the new one. And the first is a picture of the world's most famous chair. And the chair, of course, was the great icon of 20th century design, so it seems appropriate to choose it. And this is the chair that more people have seen and sat upon than any other. And it probably isn't one of the chairs that you're expecting to see, because it's not a dazzling 20th century classic by a great designer like Marcel Breuer, the Eameses, or Jasper Morrison. It's this. It's the monoblock. This is one of the cheap white plastic chairs that you can buy for sort of about 8 or 10 euros at your local discount store. And these particular monoblocks are being thrown around, to my patriotic shame, by English football fans in Stuttgart after we had lost yet another game to Germany. Now, millions of these chairs have been sold all over the world, and once you're aware of them, you see them absolutely everywhere: bars, cafes, schools, hospitals, sports stadia, factories, car parks, beaches, wherever. They're so ubiquitous that they often pop up in major international incidents on the television news, and you can tell what a design geek I am that I actually remember some of these incidents. So, for example, when Saddam Hussein was finally captured in his lair, there were 2 monoblocks in the background. And I would be happy to bet that if Osama bin Laden is ever caught, there'll be a couple of monoblocks in his hideout too. Now, it's very easy to be snobbish about these chairs, not least because they don't look very nice, but that isn't entirely fair because they have many, many virtues. They're cheap, they're light, they're easy to carry and to move around, they're stackable, they're easy to clean, they're even fairly comfortable to sit on, they're rainproof, and many of them, as these English fans attest, are used outside. So that's a pretty impressive list of some of the functional benefits that modernist designers strove to achieve throughout the 20th century. The flip side is that if the plastic breaks, these chairs are virtually impossible to repair. And because the plastic isn't biodegradable, millions of broken ones will clog up landfill sites, failing to rot for years to come. In short, they may display some of the characteristics of the modernist dream, but they're also a postmodernist nightmare. And that's why they sum up so many of the positives of the old 20th century model of design and so many of the negatives of design right now. And the second image is this one. It's a restaurant, quite a pleasant one. It's smart, it's colourful, it's clean, it's welcoming, and it's a branch of McDonald's in southeast London. And it's filled with chairs that have been staples of design history books, design museums, and posh corporate foyers for the last half-century. They are, of course, the egg and swan chairs designed by the great Danish architect Arne Jacobsen. Now, these chairs sum up many of the promises of 20th century modernism. They're the work of an exceptionally intelligent and thoughtful designer in Jacobsen. They're beautifully made by a responsible manufacturer. Formally, they're impeccable. They're elegant and refined, yet distinctive enough to be memorable. They're not exactly cheap, because they cost a couple of €100 each, but nor are they unaffordable. Millions of us have already sat on them in hotels, offices, maybe even our homes, and millions more people will now sit on them in McDonald's. So what does this mean? You could say that it's good, great even, for Arne Jacobsen's beautifully designed chairs to furnish the world's most ubiquitous fast food joint. Why on earth shouldn't people be able to chomp their Big Macs sitting on a modernist masterpiece rather than a nasty cheap chair? Doesn't this fulfill the dream of giving good design to the masses? Or has McDonald's hijacked the integrity of Jacobsen's designs and stripped them of meaning by relegating them to the role of marketing props? In other words, is this another postmodernist nightmare? So, having established where we are now, sitting comfortably on our Arne Jacobsen chair, let's look at where we go from here, at the new directions that design can take to fulfill its next promise. And I have to stress again that I'm not going to be able to cover all of the directions in here. That would be way too overwhelming, just to pinpoint some of them. So I have identified several themes that I think will be increasingly important to design in future and will distinguish it from the old model, the old promise of design. And not entirely coincidentally, they all begin with E. And the first is what I'll call ethics. It's the sea change in consumer attitudes that mean we can no longer consider anything to be well designed if there's the slightest risk of our feeling guilty about it. And this is a significant change because to a 20th century modernist, good design did include some criteria like looking good and being technically innovative, but it only had one non-negotiable factor: did it fulfill its function efficiently? We can all think of examples of things that qualify as good design without exhibiting either of the other two qualities. So an example would be the Post-it note, which works perfectly well and was certainly innovative when 3M invented it in the 1960s, but definitely doesn't look good, not least because the original colour of yellow looked rather like urine. Or you could take a beautiful book jacket, which scores highly for aesthetics and function, but can't really be described as particularly innovative. Even so, it can still constitute good design, as can the Post-it note. But I can't think of a single piece of good design in the 20th century sense that doesn't fulfill its function. As the sculptor Donald Judd once said, if a chair is not functional, if it only appears to be art, it is ridiculous. And he was right. But there's another non-negotiable factor for design now, and that's ethics, whether or not we can have a clear conscience about a design project, and that's a very significant change. Now, one of the most important examples of this is, of course, environmentalism, and that's best summed up by the grim truth that something as beautiful as this obviously is an Apple PowerBook. Actually, I think it's the MacBook Air. An Apple, of all design companies, is the one that really fulfills both the 20th and early 21st century design dream. You look at a product like this and you know that it's the sort of result of an endless battle between the designers against the laws of physics. But however gorgeous and gleaming it is, it may well end up somewhere like this. And this is an illegal recycling plant in East London, where unwanted computers are broken up, mostly by illegally employed workers, many of them asylum seekers. Any useful parts are sold for scrap, and the rest are dumped, regardless of whether or not they're toxic. And we live at a time when most of us, and by that I mean the 10% of the global population who own more than just the basics, and I'll come on to the other 90% later, already own more stuff than we need or probably want. And when, as Gert very eloquently pointed out, the environmental crisis is so severe that we can no longer pretend to ignore the ecological and ethical consequences of acquiring more. We also live at a time when designers have to live with the painful knowledge that most of what they design may well end up, often failing to rot, in landfill, or worse, just dumped. In his book Design and Change that came out this autumn, Tim Brown, the CEO of the IDEO design group in San Francisco, tells a story of how one of his colleagues was walking along an empty, very beautiful Californian beach when he spotted a colourful piece of plastic in the surf. It was an Oral-B toothbrush, and this guy had been the leader of the design team that had developed it. It was revolutionary, at least in terms of toothbrush designs, and it had won lots of design prizes and many accolades for IDEO. But whoever had bought it cared so little about it that they chucked it away in the ocean. So one of the biggest challenges, but also the most exciting opportunities for designers in the future, will be to use their skills to try to tackle this crisis, which, albeit unknowingly, they help to cause. And I'm now going to give a couple of examples of some of my favourite solutions. And the first is this. It's G-diapers, or nappies as we call them in Britain. And this is a flushable baby diaper that's now sold in North America. Now, redesigning the diaper wouldn't be the reason that most designers went to design school. It doesn't sound like the most thrilling of design assignments, but if you analyse it from an environmental perspective, it absolutely is, because conventional disposable diapers are an ecological nightmare. They're the third largest contributors to landfill sites in North America. 50 million of them are chucked away every single day, and they take up to 500 years to decompose. And here comes the yucky bit. Their contents can seep into the groundwater system and contaminate it, spreading diseases. So in that context, designing an ecologically responsible one seems absolutely heroic. And it actually took an Australian couple, Jason and Kimberly Graham-Nye, who, when they were expecting their first child, searched for an eco-friendly diaper and eventually found one that had been invented by a tiny company run by a couple of hippies in Tasmania. The hippies weren't interested in commercialising it, good for them, perfectly happy in Tasmania, so the Graham-Nyes bought the rights to it and redesigned it as the G-diaper, which consists of a biodegradable flushable pad worn inside this rather cute pair of green, obviously, pants. When the pad is soiled, you can either flush it down the toilet, or if it's wet, you can use it as compost in your garden, where it will decompose within a couple of months. So I hope you're now convinced you should devote the rest of your careers to diaper invention. And another example is this. It's the zero-emissions electric truck developed by the British manufacturer Modec, and there's obviously electric vehicles are the hottest subject in the automobile industry at the moment, and I would love to buy an electric car, but obviously I'm still stuck in the 20th century. I'm too much of a visual snob to buy any of the existing models on the market because they all look disgusting. This picture doesn't do this truck justice. They are incredibly cute and also very eco-efficient. It's powered by a battery pack that runs for 70 miles on an overnight charge, and it's very efficient for companies like FedEx that tend to make lots of stops in compact urban areas. FedEx is now testing 10 of these trucks in London, and they look so cute that it's always fun to see them purring down the streets, and even more fun if they deliver something nice to your door. Now, you could argue that an electric vehicle isn't a satisfactory design solution environmentally. It might not be guzzling as much petrol as a conventional one, but it's still burning up fossil fuel by consuming electricity. Why didn't the designer develop a genuinely eco-efficient alternative rather than compromise with something like this? And those are perfectly reasonable questions, but the electric truck is a step in the right direction, and that's better than nothing. And this underlines some of the many tensions in sustainable design, because some designers argue that it's not worth trying to produce sustainable products because it's such an enormous challenge that nothing they do can make much of a difference. And frankly, I think that's rubbish. It's just a feeble excuse. So is the claim that I hear again and again from designers, especially very successful ones over 40, that the best way to create a sustainable product is to make something of quality, on the grounds that people are likely to want to use it for longer and less likely to throw it away. Now, that is absolutely true, and it's a fine thing to do, but it still doesn't excuse their failure to address their environmental and ethical responsibilities. Now, it's very easy for me to say this as a commentator, because I, of course, comment applauding the successes and damning the failures. It's much, much, much more difficult to do in practice, and it's impossible to understate how complex the process will be. Because designing our way out of the environmental crisis will demand much more than developing eco-efficient alternatives to existing things, valuable though they are. It also will require a fundamental reassessment of what design is, how it is practiced, and how the rest of us, the 99.9% of us who aren't designers, perceive it. And one change is that our perceptions of a product's merits are no longer defined by the thing itself or our experience of using it, but by its entire life and afterlife. The way it was designed, developed, manufactured, shipped, sold, whether it can be repaired, and how it will eventually be disposed of matter just as much as what it does and whether we enjoy using it. So the G-diaper is a great example of this. Its attraction to consumers is based on what happens when they'll no longer see it or need to use it, when they chuck it away. Another change is that design will be as much about eradicating things, making them disappear, as creating new ones, whereas, of course, in the 20th century, there was this emphasis on the new always being better than the old. And one way of doing this is by squeezing multiple functions into one object. So take the Apple iPhone. Now, Apple has come under fire from groups like Greenpeace for its environmental record, although they have lightened up on it recently. But some of its products are surprisingly interesting examples of sustainability, and the iPhone is one. Just think of all of the other objects you don't have to have if you've got an iPhone, or a BlackBerry, or most other smartphones. A phone, a watch, a diary, an alarm clock, a barometer, an atlas, a sat-nav system, an internet browser, an address book, a dictionary, a DVD player, a CD player, and that's just the standard features. I haven't even started on the thousands of things you can do with iPhone applications. It's also a great example of rather subtle product recycling, because once you've bought an iPhone, the software is updated automatically, so you don't need to buy a new device. A friend was talking very fondly the other night about how he still uses the original iPhone, saying how much he enjoys looking at the scratches and stains that it's acquired since he's owned it, because it's those flaws, that patina, that make it feel as though it's his. Another way of achieving the same end will be for designers to develop ways of enabling us to benefit from the same things, for example, by designing new business models for sharing and rental services. Ironically, a great example of this is the private jet rental service NetJets. It's a posh form of what we Britons call timeshare, cunningly rebranded as fractional ownership, which sounds much more glamorous, which enables several people to share the same private jet. And exactly the same principle is applied to cars by the Zipcar service in the States that's now expanding in Europe, and all the bicycle rental schemes like the super successful Vélib one in Paris. So now we'll move on to another new direction for design that, like environmentalism, addresses a flaw in the 20th century model, its failure to address our individual needs and wishes by empowering the rest of us to participate in the design process. This will be a dramatic change for designers and their way of working, because for most of the last century, successful designers at least, tended to be portrayed as omnipotent heroes. There were disappointingly few design heroines, of course, who controlled every element of their work. This wasn't strictly true. Design has always been a team sport, and even the most inspiring projects are subject to compromises and constraints that we tend to conveniently forget for fear of spoiling a good story. But it's a powerful myth, often because of the personalities involved. One of my favorite examples is the great Finnish architect and designer Alvar Aalto. He absolutely dominated design and architecture in Finland in the early years of the 20th century, and he was both a very charismatic and very extrovert, and it must be said, egomaniacal character. And he was frequently referred to in the Finnish press as the second most important person in Finland after the president. And indeed, he was the only other person in the country for whom Finnair, the Finnish airline, was under strict instructions to hold its flight if Alvar Aalto, the great architect, was due to board it. And so time after time, Finnair passengers would sit there tapping their watches, waiting for him to come on, wondering when he was going to appear. And he would always tend to make a grand entrance 10 minutes after the scheduled takeoff. Finally, Finnair staff realized that he would often arrive at the airport on time, but because he could never resist making the grand entrance, he would tell his chauffeur to drive round the airport several times very slowly so he could bounce on the plane and everyone would stare at him. So entertaining though these stories are, sadly for all you would-be Aaltos in the audience, that era is definitely over. And an increasingly important part of design will be for designers to empower and enable other people to contribute to their work. Now, this partly involves enabling fellow designers to do so through open source research and development processes, which obviously began in software design and are now being adopted by designers in many, many other disciplines. I recently read of a drugs company that was doing this. But empowerment also involves designers delegating parts of the process to the people who will use the end result. For example, they may develop a design formula for others to implement rather than a finished entity. And there are historic precedents for this. Among the most famous is Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, which for me is one of the most successful examples of sustainable and humanitarian design there has ever been. It's provided emergency shelter for people in desperate situations for over 60 years. Hundreds of thousands of geodesic domes have been constructed all over the world based on Fuller's original instructions and made from whatever materials, whether it's old clothes, plastic sheeting, scraps of wood, art to hand, but he never actually designed the finished product. It was simply the formula for it. And a contemporary example of this is this. It's the ceramic water purifier that the US nonprofit Potters for Peace devised to purify water in areas of Africa and Latin America with limited access to clean drinking water. It's a simple series of ceramic filters that literally drains the dirt out of the water. But rather than make it themselves and ship it out, Potters for Peace teaches local people how to do so they can build their own businesses. Now, techies tend to argue that the logical outcome of all this democratization of design, will be customized production, where the end user can co-design a product to suit their needs. And we've seen lots of superficial styling examples of this. The Nike website, where you can style your own trainers, picking out an interior of your Fiat 500 car, but more and more sophisticated applications are now feasible because of advances in rapid manufacturing technology, which enable entire objects to be made with such speed and precision that they can be personalized and materialized. The Belgian company did a lot of work in this. A group of young London-based designers and programmers, Digital Forming, has prototyped a rapid manufacturing design process whereby people can change the shape, size, and color of a range of plastic objects. So this is a series of lemon squeezes that shows how the shape can be changed, and they call this process co-designing. Now, some designers criticize this. They say that it undermines their professionalism and will unleash a flood of nasty novelties rather than having real benefits. And looking at these lemon squeezers, I do feel sympathetic towards them. But there are sustainable benefits to this too. Manufacturing to order uses less raw materials and means that you have to carry less stock. And critically, it can also be more inclusive because it can address very specific individual needs, such as the special requirements for people with disabilities possibilities in terms of grip or fit. There's also a cultural imperative for this degree of empowerment in design, because the 20th century modernist model of standardized design provided affordable products for millions of people. That was its great achievement. But the outcome was often bland, impersonal, and too inflexible to satisfy individual needs. These disadvantages increasingly outweigh the advantages, partly because we're so spoilt from owning so much standardized stuff that we take its benefits for granted, but also because of the way that our consumer expectations have changed. Now, many of the most interesting design projects of recent years have tried to address this by imbuing industrial objects with depth and meaning. And here in the Netherlands, Helle Jongerius, I think, is here in the audience somewhere in the gloom, has done so by adding flaws and idiosyncrasies to her products, creating a sort of optical illusion that tricked us into thinking they were as precious and personal as handcrafted pieces. The Japanese designer Naoto Fukasawa adopted a different approach in Supernormal, the exhibition he curated with the British designer Jasper Morrison. They identified a collection of objects, including a big ballpoint pen, a pair of Fiskars scissors, whose elemental qualities made them so gentle and thoughtful and pleasing to look at and use, they instinctively felt right. And the German designer Konstantin Giertych has now picked up the baton in Design Real. This is the exhibition that he opened last week at the Serpentine Gallery in London, and he chose 43 industrial products, including this megaphone and welding mask, but that he considers to be interesting in terms of what they tell us about contemporary life. So, for example, he didn't choose a car, which you'd normally expect to see in a design exhibition. He chose the battery of a Tesla Roadster electric sports car because he was so enthralled by the story of how soaring mobile phone sales had spurred more R&D investment by the battery industry. So finally a battery had been invented that was small and powerful enough to power a car. So these are interesting strategies that give us a richer and more sophisticated understanding of the material world that designers have created. But the desire for empowerment, for truly democratized design, is ineluctable. And if you think of the freedom we enjoy in determining other aspects of our daily life, the way you randomly surf the internet, foraging different bits of information by flitting from site to site, rather than reading the pre-edited information presented to you in a newspaper like mine, or how millions of people create their virtual worlds in Second Life or The Sims or by using Spore, it isn't surprising that they'd want to feel similarly empowered in other aspects of their lives. And there is, of course, one brilliant example of design democracy in action, which is the iPhone applications phenomenon. Over 1 billion iPhone apps were sold in less than a year, and they were invented first by hackers who hacked into their iPhones to develop their own programs for them. And Apple initially planned to clamp down on them, but realized they were so popular, so it launched an app store. It probably also realized it could keep a percentage of the profits, so it now has a booming business from all these DIY programmers. And another new direction for design will be its role not to continue to create the sort of tangible, but to create experiences, the intangible, often by regulating our behavior. Now, historically, this has always been an important role, particularly in graphic and communication design. So one of my favorite examples is this, a great British icon, the London Underground map, which was designed by Harry Beck in 1933 when London was expanding into the suburbs so rapidly, and so was the Underground network, so it was absolutely impossible to design a geographic map that people could understand, particularly if they were rushing along a platform. He hit upon the idea of creating a diagrammatic map based on an electrical circuit, and this is the result. It is a variation of it is still used by the London Underground today and dozens of other underground networks. But the complexity of the 1930s London Underground pales in comparison to the tsunami of information that assails us today. The volume of data is greater than ever, and it's going to become even greater in future, and so is its complexity and the speed at which it changes. And this is why one of the most interesting areas of design now that will become increasingly dynamic in future is visualization. This is the fusion of design, computer science, and mathematics that enables us to make sense of complex, rapidly changing phenomena by using a dynamic new visual language that simplifies complexity and can adapt to change. And this is one of my favorite visualizations, which illustrates the genetic difference between humans and chimpanzees, and it was developed by the American software designer Ben Fry. The chimpanzee's face is composed of the 95,000 symbols in the computer code for the human genome, and the 9 red dots that you can see highlight the only differences between a chimpanzee and us. So just think of how many science books you would have to plow through to understand that, or you can just look at this picture. A second way in which good design regulates our behavior is by what's called user interface software, the operating systems with which we control digital devices. If you think of old-fashioned analog objects like a chair or a spoon, even if you were a Martian who just landed on Earth and you'd never seen one before, you could probably work out roughly what you were supposed to do with them simply from the way it looks. And the same applies to electrical products like record players and television sets, because in those days the design cliché of form following function was broadly true. The microchip, of course, destroyed that by creating a new generation of digital devices whose size, scale, and appearance bears no relation to their function. If you had never seen this before, this tiny metal box, how on earth could you guess what it does? It is, of course, an iPod shuffle, but if nobody had told you, how could you guess? I mean, it looks much more like a brooch than anything else, which is actually a joke of the Apple design team, that of course one of its functions is to be a clip, a brooch that you can put on your jacket, and so that actually is the form of the shuffle. So this is why the quality of the user interface software that controls digital products is so important in defining whether or not we'll enjoy using them. If the UI is bad, operating something like this would seem fiddly, tricky, and overcomplicated, and we've all had cell phones like that. You usually end up blaming yourself for not being able to work them. But if the UI is good, as it is on this shuffle, operating the device is so simple and natural and intuitive that you don't even have to think about it. And a third, and arguably even more important way in which design will shape our experiences in future by changing our behavior is in the burgeoning field of social design. And this involves applying designers' skills to human concerns by addressing social problems like caring for the elderly, returning the long-term unemployed to the workplace, and improving healthcare. And design hasn't traditionally been seen as a solution to these problems other than by designing, say, hospital buildings or producing pretty leaflets, but that's changing. And that's partly because of the crisis within the social sciences and the recognition by policymakers that many of the public sector systems and institutions that ran our lives in the last century have now broken down. Design is not the only sector that feels it's in crisis. And it's partly because the same politicians are now willing to experiment with new ways of rebuilding them, but also because a new generation of designers want to work in these fields. And this has produced the new breed of social designers, typically working in collaboration with specialists from other areas like psychology, anthropology, economics, computer programming, ethnography, and so on. And designers are useful members of these teams because often without knowing, they're trained to identify problems, to apply lateral thinking to come up with ingenious solutions, and to use their communication skills to persuade funders and the end user to accept the solution. There are now some very inspiring examples of social design in action, and one of my favorites is this. It's the Southwark Circle concept developed by Participal, a social design group in London, to improve the care of elderly people in a poor area of southeast London. It combines the roles of an old people's club, a self-help group, and a concierge service. Each circle consists of elderly people living in the same area. When they join, they're visited by an assessor who identifies what help they need and, critically, what they can contribute to the rest of the group. So, for example, a man whose wife has died recently might be good at doing accounts, but, if he's been very sexist for most of his married life, hopeless at cooking. So he could help fellow circle members with the former, and they could help him out in the kitchen. There are also social gatherings for each circle, and they benefit from group discounts on utility bills and local cinemas. Now, all of this sounds like common sense, but social scientists spent decades failing to come up with it, and it took a social design group to devise it. And the idea is that rather than receiving the standardized services offered to every elderly resident, each individual is now likelier to get their help help they need, as well as the chance to make new friends, and critically, to raise their self-esteem by helping other members. This prototype has been running in Southwark for 18 months. It's so successful, it's been expanded throughout the borough, and Participle is now running 5 other trial schemes in 2 other London boroughs, central Birmingham, the rural county of Suffolk, and the suburbs of Manchester, to see how it works in different contexts. And if it works there, it may well be rolled out nationally. So this brings me on to a final new direction: designing for everyone. Because another great failure of 20th century modernism is the ludicrous fact that design is still targeted at the people who need it the least, to the richest 10% of the global population, people like us, not those who need it the most, the other 90%, nearly 6 billion people who can't afford basic products and services, half of whom don't even have regular access to food, shelter, or clean water, and 1 billion of whom will go to bed hungry tonight. So clearly this is crazy, and some designers have challenged it over the years. Buckminster Fuller was of course one, but it's now a priority for many young designers, and non-profit networks like Architecture for Humanity and Project H Design, both based in San Francisco, assemble networks of volunteers to work on emergency and longer-term development projects all over the world. Architecture for Humanity's slogan says it all for me: design like you give a damn. And it would be wonderful to think that designing like you give a damn is the next promise of design. So thanks to them and to other groups, there are dozens of examples of successful humanitarian design projects. This is the Hippo Roller project that Project H worked on with the farmers who originally developed it in Nigeria, and it literally, these plastic rollers help people to roll large quantities of water in areas where it's scarce over very large areas, rather than having to carry it on their backs, in which case they can't carry as much water, and it's obviously difficult and painful. Other projects are much more ambitious, like the famous One Laptop Per Child initiative to develop a cheap educational computer for the world's poorest children using open source technology. Now, One Laptop Per Child has come under fire from all directions. I know that whenever I write about it, letters of complaints will flood in to the paper, and they always do. Development economists hate it, environmentalists loathe it, educationalists criticize it, and so does the IT industry. It has failed in its original goal, which was incredibly ambitious. It was to redesign a laptop so it would sell for as little as $100 and to ship 6 million of them. However, this laptop does cost $180 each, and they have shipped 1 million of them already, and they have firm orders for 1 million more. That's an awful lot of laptops for kids who'd never had one before. And OLPC has also had a huge impact on the IT industry by opening up the market for compact tablet computers, like the one that Apple has long been rumoured to be about to launch. So it's certainly not a failure. In many ways, it's a scintillating success. Had Nicholas Negroponte, who founded it, said he planned to distribute 2 million laptops to the world's poorest children in 4 years when he first launched the project, we'd have all thought how amazing that was. He simply sort of rather over-egged it. And it would, of course, be lovely to think that the real promise of design in the future is not that this sort of solution will be developed here in the West and then shipped out to the developing world, but that it will be developed there. So undoubtedly the next promise of design will be as likely to come from Africa, China, Latin America, India, and other parts of Asia as much as it is here. So for all the problems and challenges and obstacles that I've alluded to, I hope you also share my enthusiasm that this is a really thrilling time for design and designers. Because if you look back historically, design always flourishes in periods of change, for better or worse. That's because it is an agent of change that enables us to understand shifts in the world around us and to interpret changes in science, technology, culture, and the economy into things that help to make our lives more efficient and enjoyable. And this is, of course, a time of absolutely unprecedented change when all of those shifts are accelerating, as are the extremes of speed and scale that we encounter every day. The economic and environmental crises are deepening, and the social and political systems that used to run our lives are crumbling. So all of this creates amazing opportunities for designers if they embrace a new approach to design, one that's more fluid, more responsive, collaborative, and inclusive. They will have to collaborate more with other designers, other disciplines, and the people who use their work. They'll have to be a lot more open-minded about it and realizing that they'll increasingly be empowering other people rather than controlling the outcome themselves. They will have to be more questioning, not least in ensuring that before they design anything, they work out whether it's really needed. And also, if based on the Apple iPhone apps phenomenon, designers are the best people to design it. They will have to be absolutely confident about the ethical and environmental consequences of every aspect of their work. They'll have to navigate the minefield of the public sector to crack social problems and the quagmire of development politics to address humanitarian issues. And they will have to focus on the needs of the underprivileged 90% and empower them to address those needs in future as much, if not more, than those of the privileged 10%. Now, if they succeed in even a smidgen of that, design and designers will play a much, much more powerful role in our lives in future and will not only fulfill the next promise of design, but the old one too. So thank you very much.